So let us move on to our next presenter, Hina, from University of Cambridge, with her sacred somatics and Islamic perspective on the role of the body in the care of the dying. The procedure is the same, Hina, and I will put in the chat whenever you're close to the end. So yes, you can start.
Thank you, and thank you everyone, and special thank you to the organisers, Professor Farouk, Professor Rustam, for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you all for being here. I'm really very humbled actually to be amongst such luminous scholars and friends, and feeling somewhat out of my depth, but looking forward to the conversations and connections that will emerge over the next few days. Perfect. So my paper title has changed slightly from what I submitted, from what Professor Maisami read out. So the title is now Cultivating Prayerful Presence at the Bedside, from Mastery Towards Mystery. And this paper is offered as a kind of meditation, really, on the phenomenology or the embodied experience, both of illness and of caring for, or as I like to say, accompanying the ill person. And I want to begin with a short autobiographical note on what inspired this inquiry into embodiment and accompaniment. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic embedded one mantra into our everyday existence: social distancing. Our daily interactions had to conform to a new normal, as spontaneous gestures like handshakes and hugs were off limits. Several studies have addressed the detrimental psychological effects of such physical distancing, ranging from the phenomenon of, quote, touch hunger, as tactile contact was curtailed or minimized, to instances of prolonged grief disorder, as individuals could not be present with their loved ones during their final moments. Reading such accounts, I paused to reflect on my own experience of having recently cared for and having lost my father to a long illness. What might it have meant if my family and I weren't able to be physically present with him during his last moments, to have witnessed him gently surrendering his breath into God's hands? In those final moments, we could not, of course, reverse the trajectory of his illness, nor could we help in any medically meaningful way, but we could be there, embodying our love and what flows organically from this love, a commitment never to leave. I recall here the words of the Swiss psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who observed that communication with a dying person may become, quote, more non-verbal than verbal. The patient may just make a gesture of the hand to invite us to sit down for a while, or may just hold our hand and ask us to sit in silence, end quote. Such presence, enacted in and through our bodies, is not about controlling or curing suffering, but about meditatively, lovingly bearing witness to it. With these prefatory thoughts in mind, then, I offer this paper as a reflection on the spiritual significance of human embodiment and on the role of bodily afflictions in the nurturance of individual and collective virtues. Specifically, I consider the spiritual import of both embodied illness as that which confirms our status as creatures of God, and the embodied accompaniment by carers of the ill person as that which reflects God's own love in worldly settings. Adapting the words of the title of this conference, I hope to show that when we move, quote, from the divine to the human, we are in fact returned to the divine, without whom we cannot attain a proper understanding of the human. So I begin this paper with a general reflection on the sacredness of the body as understood in the Islamic spiritual tradition, which sets forth the body as a finite locus of the divine presence. This lays the foundation for my subsequent reflections on the nature of bodily illness and disease. For indeed, if the body is the site of sacrality, it is also the site of suffering. Entwining these themes of sacrality and suffering, Sufi writers have variously understood bodily affliction as a crucible for cultivating spiritual virtues, and more specifically, the divine attributes. Across this paper, I will foreground this body-spirit nexus in this way. Paradoxically, through our experience of our embodied creatureliness as crystallized in our encounters with illness and ultimately with our own mortality, we reflect something of the divine in whom we gradually become recentered. Building on this principle of the finite as the fitting habitat of the infinite, I then reflect on what it means to be present in a bodily manner with and for the one who is ill, because such human presence manifests God's own compassionate outreach to the world. I argue that the practice of visiting and being with the sick embodies an ethic of mystery over mastery. In this vision, the other is not an object to be controlled or domesticated, but a fellow creature who is enfolded in and forever journeying towards the divine. Sufi writers have variously articulated the spiritual meaning of the body, seeing human materiality not as an obstacle which should be denied, but as a sign of the non-material divine. This intersection of the spiritual and the material is vividly expressed in the Quranic vision of a cosmos which is always engaged in a loving act of divine praise. The finite world is, so to speak, brimming over with the infinite, such that materiality continually reflects as well as expresses the eternal light. When God fashions Adam, the Quran tells us, God breathes into Adam of God's spirit, and this elevation of the human person becomes the basis of the angel's prostration before Adam. In this life-infusing encounter that is said to be, quote, more intimate than a kiss, God expresses the divine proximity to the human being. Like a humble clay vessel, the human body assumes its shape and integrity by being emptied from inside, such that what may appear to be unreachably transcendent comes to rest in our bodily midst. Scott Kugel highlights the central paradox of this cosmic vision in this way. On the one hand, the body is material and is therefore vulnerable to spatio-temporal limitations. But on the other hand, it is materiality energized by spirit and is therefore, quote, eternal, unbounded by space, opening into the infinite. This opening outwards of the embodied human beyond herself is specifically intimated in the Hadith, which states that God created Adam in his surah, or image or form. In Sufi metaphysics, this notion of a divine imprint came to denote the fullness of the human being as the locus of all divine names. And in Sufi ethics, it would designate the spiritual telos of human existence, as expressed in the prophetic injunction to, quote, qualify yourselves with the qualities of God. That the human person is the shimmering sight of the divine reality is further echoed by the mystic and philosopher Ibn Arabi, who we've already heard about, who foregrounds the sacrality of the body by appealing to the Quranic account of Adam's creation. Into what Ibn Arabi terms the city of the body, God blows his enlivening spirit, and thus the body becomes, in all of creation, the, quote, seat of the highest reality. Crucially, Ibn Arabi elaborates on another somatic image of the Quran to highlight the cosmic status of the human person, namely that of God creating Adam with both his hands. That Adam is the recipient of the divine touch is symbolic of the exaltation of human beings in the hierarchy of existence. So the human being alone is touched by the divine hands. This is why, for Ibn Arabi, God chastises Iblis, or Satan, for his arrogant refusal to submit to Adam. The verse reads, "What prevented you from prostrating to that which I created with my hands?" Interestingly, Ibn Arabi draws our attention to the shared trilateral root of the Arabic terms for human being and touching, to emphasize that what makes human is precisely this divine touch. And here's a quote from Ibn Arabi where he draws out this connection. I won't read it out, but we will return to this image of the divine touch later on in the talk. So far we've seen that the fact of human embodiment is central to the spiritual imagination of the Islamic tradition, wherein the body is regarded as a luminous locus of the divine presence, uniquely enfolding the divine breath and lovingly touched by the divine hands. The body stands as a receptacle of the sacred. The crucial paradox here is that the finite serves as the matrix of the infinite. And so our distinctly creaturely faculties become sacred spaces in which we may progressively reflect the divine. Developing this paradox, I want now to explore how the embodied experience of illness has been understood as a somatic site of witnessing and knowing God. If our bodies are never simply inert matter, but gesture beyond themselves towards the spiritual, so too do our experiences of bodily affliction serve as channels of spiritual perfection. I'll reflect on the substance of the spiritual perfection through the lens of three distinct but interrelated virtues: servitude, patience, and gratitude, ubudiyya, sabr, and shukr. Muhammad Ghali, in his seminal work, Islam and Disability, Perspectives in Theology and Jurisprudence, characterizes these three attributes as the cardinal traits which are reiterated across Islamic mystical texts and which are specifically invoked as the spiritual fruits of one's trials and tribulations. Turning then to the first of our triad, ubudiyya, which means servitude, is described in Sufi texts as an essential trait on the spiritual path, referring to the state of complete reliance on the eternal God. Ubudiyya is thus intricately connected to the attribute of faqiri, which denotes one's creaturely poverty, expressed through one's ontological dependence on the eternally rich God. As highlighted in Surah 35, verse 15, O people, it is you who stand in need of Allah, while Allah is the self-sufficient, the praiseworthy. The Asharite theologian Al-Iz ibn Abdul Salam noted that the realization of one's servitude to the divine is one of the most important benefits of one's suffering, which reattunes the human person to the abiding truth that she is always in need of God. Indeed, the experience of sickness or illness disabuses us, often in an immediate and visceral way, of the illusion of control. Illness and disease have the quality of a sudden interruption or imposition, frustrating the projected trajectories of our lives and the habitual patterns of our living. To suffer an illness or disease is to be reminded that we are, despite our pretensions, radically limited beings. And this human-shaped limitation attests to the essential vulnerability of our bodies and our varying ventures to death. Indeed, the great Sufi scholar Al-Kushairi wrote that ubudiyya is the cornerstone of relation with the divine for those afflicted with bodily impairments or other forms of suffering and who are seeking spiritual nourishment. This theme is expressed in the following meditation of Rumi, where he claims that the purgative power of suffering is a window into the light of God. So Rumi writes, between God and his servant are just two veils, and all other veils manifest out of them. They are health and wealth. The man who is well in body says, where is God? I do not know and I do not see. As soon as pain afflicts him, he begins to say, O God, communing and conversing with God. So you see that health was his veil and God was hidden under that pain. As much as man has wealth and resources, he procures the means to gratifying his desires and is preoccupied night and day with that. The moment indigence appears, his ego is weakened and he goes round about God. In other words, when our wealth and health are intact, we may fail to direct our attention to anything beyond these bounties, which are precarious. That God is hidden under the pain of illness highlights that bodily suffering irradiates a spiritual plenitude by recentering the individual in her essential servanthood. Dissolving the veil of self-sufficiency and unveiling the human person's poverty, illness has a way of awakening us to the elemental truth of finitude, which characterizes all of creation. In thus aligning us with our creaturely truth, the individual is yet drawn closer to God, and this proximity is embodied, as Rumi affirms, through an intimate dialogue with God. The servant calls upon the God who first called the servant into being, or to echo the idiom of Rumi, the servant, quote, goes round about God, encircling the God who primordially encircles the servant. Rumi's theme of the divine reality who is somehow concealed under our bodily suffering returns us to the crucial principle of Sufi anthropology, which we outlined earlier, namely that the telos of the spiritual path is to cultivate in oneself the divine qualities. Here then is a way to re-articulate our central paradox. The finite is a fitting container of the infinite. This co-presence is exemplified in the three qualities that we are discussing here. If the virtue of ubudiyya is a creaturely value, which confirms our ontological distinction from God, the virtues of sabr and shukr, which we will now explore, are divine qualities or names through which we reflect something of God's inexhaustible fullness. In elaborating the meaning of these divine attributes, the great theologian Al-Ghazali affirms that sabr refers to God's transcendence of any inclination to haste, such that God disposes each affair, quote, in its proper time, in the way in which it needs to be and according to what it requires. God's shukr refers to the divine generosity in bestowing boundless rewards upon his righteous servants. Ghazali thus states that God alone is, quote, absolutely grateful, where this gratitude implies not a need or privation in God, which is somehow fulfilled by human beings, but denotes a superabundant generosity. In response to our good deeds of just a few days, God pours forth an infinite stream of blessings and compassion. How then are these divine attributes of patience and gratitude kept ablaze in the human person across the volatile valleys of suffering? The virtue of sabr is, of course, extolled in several Quranic verses and prophetic narrations, and across many Sufi life worlds, it has been identified as a station on the spiritual path. At this station, the aspirant bears hardship and joy with equanimity and self-restraint, secure in the knowledge that all things proceed from, are energized by, and return to God. By therefore guarding against despair during difficulties and against pride in times of prosperity, one enacts or embodies one's ontological lightness. We meet all circumstances with the humility befitting a perfect servant of God, aware of the radical precarity of our being that rests like a, quote, feather on the breath of God. In the context of suffering, patience is understood as the integral virtue of enduring one's afflictions with faith and fortitude. Ghazali analogizes sabr to a tree and affirms, quote, we do not know when God will make the means of sustenance easy. We must empty the place, meaning the heart, and wait for the descent of mercy at the appointed time. This is similar to preparing the earth, clearing it of weeds, and sowing the seeds. And yet all this will be to no avail without rain. The divine mercy is presented here as rain, which fertilizes the soil of our hearts in which patience may become deeply rooted. The fruits of patience thus involve a steadfast waiting on God. Just as rain issues forth spontaneously from the sky, so too does God's mercy take the form of a sacred surprise. With regards to illness and disease, this waiting upon God may involve the hope for a time of worldly relief, or indeed the trust in God's promise of eternal bliss for those who remain patient through life's turbulences. Particularly in the intractable context of a terminal illness, we might say that the expectation of this divine showering of mercy is gently deferred to the afterlife. Patience is thus inwoven with trust, both virtues denoting a tranquil resting in God, with the assurance that one is never forgotten to the God to whom even the falling of a leaf is known. This mode of patient, heartful resting in and with God is articulated beautifully in Surah 52, verses 48 to 9, where God, speaking of those who deny the message of divine oneness, instructs the prophet to wait patiently for the divine command. God assures the prophet of his unwavering presence to him, asserting that the prophet remains beheld by God's gaze. In situations where our patience too is put to the test, such as sickness and disease and quintessentially terminal illness, we might say that we are called on to enact our own imitatio Muhammadi and to recall that we too are lovingly held in the divine sight. Embodying forth something of the prophetic patience, we ultimately mirror the archetypal patience of God, who unfolds all things in their right time and who rewards our emulation thereof. Crucially, it is not only that God is the transcendental prototype of patience and the one who mercifully brings the seeds of our patience to full fruition. Indeed, the Quran also affirms that patience is itself implanted in us by God. As the Quran affirms in Surah 16, verse 127, again addressing the Prophet regarding those who oppose the message of Islam. Be patient, for your patience is but from Allah. On this note of God's giving to the servant, we turn to our final virtue of gratitude, or shukr, conceived in the Islamic imagination as the appropriate spiritual response to the plenteous divine gifts. This quality ordinarily refers to a particular blessing or favour, such that one expresses one's gratitude to the infinitely generous God for this bestowal of fortune. Whilst gratitude is thus the fitting response in times of joy and comfort, Sufi writers have often stressed that the spiritual summit of shukr lies in cultivating gratitude in the midst of one's afflictions. For instance, one's encounter with illness may encourage a gratitude for the health that one has had for all these years. However, the stage beyond this is to thank God for the affliction itself, which demands a more refined spiritual attunement. The theologian Ibn al-Qayyim asserts that one way to cultivate this mode of gratitude is to keep in mind, quote, blessings always assume the guise of afflictions, described in this way. To see the beauty in a trial is to, quote, imagine the rose from the thorn, and to imagine the non-visible part to be the whole. In other words, to arrive at the summit of gratitude is to see the rose not as a superfluous ornament to the thorn, but as implicitly enfolded in the thorn, and thus to see one's experiences of loss as brimming over with a spiritual fullness. As a final important word on gratitude, we may note that the paradox we outlined earlier regarding the virtue of patience, namely that we are rewarded for that which God himself gives us, is reiterated in the context of our gratitude. This paradox is articulated by Ghazali in these terms. When God is grateful for a good action, he praises this action, yet in thus praising the works of his servants, Ghazali notes, he praises his own work, for their works are his creations. In other words, God entrusts the patient and grateful servant with the very qualities through which she may return to God. This reciprocity of the divine human giving, such that we give to God that which God gifts us, is elegantly hinted at in Surah 52, verse 48 to 9, which we mentioned earlier. In enjoining the Prophet to remain patient, these verses set forth what I call a rather beautiful wall of witnessing. God assures Muhammad that he is never forgotten by God, but remains constantly within God's sight. He's then instructed to glorify God as he moves through the world and to praise God during part of the night and with the fading of the stars at dawn. In response to God's primordial witnessing of the servant, to praise or express gratitude to God represents an embodied form of reciprocally bearing witness to the divine blessings. In short, then, illness and disease, as understood across Sufi life worlds, represent a spiritually transmutative experience by which the embodied sufferer may realize and respond to her divine origin. If illness and disease are thus intended to orient us more fully to God, they are also, crucially, events of opening outwards to our fellow human others. In the Muslim worldview, the journey through an illness is not meant to be undertaken alone. Hence the recurrent emphasis in the Hadith literature on visiting and caring for the sick. In this final section, I want to reflect on these relational dimensions of illness and the ways that being finitely present to the sick person mirrors the infinite divine compassion. I frame this discussion within the theological concept of hospitality as elaborated by Mona Siddiqui, who situates human benevolence against God's primordial hospitality. In its general sense, Siddiqui writes, Islamic hospitality refers to the virtue of giving, quote, voluntarily and without compensation. In many religious traditions, Siddiqui notes, the act of hosting the guest or accommodating the stranger is imbued with spiritual meaning, for the stranger is often regarded as a locus of the divine presence. For instance, the prophet Abraham graciously hosted 3 visitors, providing them with food and shelter, unaware that they were angels in guise. This ethic of reaching out to the unknown other is, of course, crystallized in the multiple Quranic injunctions to give charity, to feed the poor, and to look after widows, travelers, and orphans. Such hospitality actively subverts the transactional economy of exchange. It must be given, the Quran affirms, without expectation of a reward. When revered and enacted as a divine duty, hospitality is not simply about, quote, making physical room for others in our homes, but it is essentially an attitude to life. We need to make room for others in our hearts and minds and with our words. At the heart of hospitality is thus a radical regard for others on the level of their fundamental humanity. Indeed, whereas contemporary understandings of hospitality veer towards exclusivity, insofar as we invite into our hearts and homes only those who are already known to us or those who we wish to know, the scriptural emphasis is often placed on those who are nameless strangers and not just invited guests. This principle is vividly reflected in the Islamic tradition on visiting the sick, which, as Ahmed Ragab's recent work reveals, was seen as a communal obligation irrespective of personal relationships. In extending ourselves in this way towards the unknown other, we mirror something of God's primordial hosting of all of creation, which flows forth, as Sufi cosmology affirms, from the superabundant mercy or rahmah of God. Offering hospitality at the bedside without regard for personal connections or benefits becomes a human way to imitate the cosmic generosity of God. In this sacred emulation, then, hospitality is not only about the loving treatment of those who arrive in our midst, such as the unexpected traveler or stranger, but demands an active going out to the other in humility and compassion. The sacrality of this human-to-human outreach is focalized in the prophetic traditions narrating the virtue of visiting the sick, which, reflecting a crucial theme of this paper, highlight the deeply embodied nature of offering comfort and healing to the other. Indeed, these traditions attest that each embodied act of visitation bears its distinctive spiritual meaning. In one narration, it is said that as a visitor begins his journey, a caller from heaven declares, quote, "May you, i.e. the visitor, and your steps be blessed, and may you find your place in heaven." This image of a spiritual canopy reappears in the prophetic statement that a visitor, quote, "walks under a shade from heaven" as he journeys towards the dwellings of the sick person. And in another tradition, we are told that, quote, "a visitor wades in mercy up to his knees, and when he sits, mercy covers him all." Reaffirming this centrality of the body, the Prophet emphasized the importance of gently touching the sick person as an act of consoling and companioning. It is of the completion of visiting the sick that you extend your hand to him, ask him how he is, put your hand on him, and it is of the completion of your greeting that you shake his hand. Ibn Battal, the commentator on Hadith literature, similarly wrote that placing one's hand on the patient is a sign of care and a way to feel how much the patient is struggling. Returning to Ibn Arabi's symbolic interpretation of the divine touch, we may view this humanly enacted touch as a finite mirroring of the primordial divine touch. By extending a compassionate hand to the other, we reflect the tender divine outreach or touch which gently affirms and bears witness to the other's humanity. Crucially, touch denotes participation in a deeper sense too. As Ibn Battal identified, to touch the sick person physically is to be touched or moved by their pain inwardly. Thus, to truly be with the sick person is to share in their suffering, and indeed to be transformed by the encounter. In this hospitable outreach, Safaruk Chowdhury writes, the quote, artificial boundary between the guest, the sick person, and the host, the visitor, is dissolved, such that the host recognizes the dignity of the guest and appreciates the gift of serving her. Part of this reversal of roles involves the recognition that the sick person is, in some sense, closer to God, and thus, alongside the traditions that enjoin the visitor to pray for the patient, we find narrations that advise the visitor to ask the patient to pray for them. The sick person who resides, quote, in the confines of the divine presence becomes the giver of divine blessings to the visitor. Indeed, God affirms that he abides in the dwellings of the sick person, and a failure to visit the suffering individual is thus a failure to visit God. In the famous hadith on the screen, it is said, on the day of judgment, God says, O son of Adam, I had fallen sick and you did not visit me. The servant would say, O Lord, how could I visit you when you are the Lord of all the living? God says, did you not know that my servant so-and-so has fallen sick and you did not visit him? Had you visited him, you would have found me there. So central is this modality of withness or presence that one is enjoined in a hadith to accompany the sick person even when they can no longer be cured. So we are told, when one of you visits the ill, then reassure him regarding his lifespan. Indeed, that will not repel anything, but it will comfort his soul. With this insight into the unswerving divine omnipresence, even when one cannot repel a disease, one can still offer comfort and healing to the soul. In this sense, the other is not an object to be grasped or controlled, but is to be gently affirmed and accompanied in their suffering. To conclude then, I've tried to show how the Islamic ethos of encounter with God and engagement with fellow human beings can be characterized as an attitude of mystery and the rejection of attempts at mastery. This renunciation of control is, of course, most powerfully embodied in the final destination of all beings, death. The individual is entrusted to and held within what Ibn Arabi calls the divine womb of the grave until she is raised before the sight of her Lord. On this image of witnessing, it is said that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, his closest companion, Abu Bakr, entered the Prophet's home, unveiled the Prophet's face, gazed at the Prophet, and gently kissed his forehead. We might say that this final embodied display of tenderness and love, mediated through the faculties of sight and touch, share in and reflect the ever-luminous gaze and ever-faithful touch of God. Indeed, in the final touching to prepare the body for burial and commending the person to the earth, we bodily bear witness to the fact that all things in life and in death belong wholly to God. There is a tender beauty in this letting go of the individual, safely entrusting her to her earthly womb, much like the beauty of running one's hand through a gently flowing stream, a touch whose serenity lies in the interplay of approaches and retreats, of proximity and distance, and of being together and departure. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. Well, I'm looking at questions here. So we have the first one from Amin. Echoing the words of Jesus Christ in the Gospels and the Hadith Qudsi, the one who suffers is a locus through which God asks us to mirror his act of all mercy and all giving, all merciful and all giving. This is also a consolation for one in suffering, for in the lowest moment we are taught paradoxically that we attain the highest realms. Or do you think that you will enter paradise while such has not yet come to you? And yes, they were, this is okay. So has not yet come to you, has come to those who passed on before you. They were touched by poverty and hardship and were shaken until the messenger and those who believe with him said, when is the help of Allah? Unquestionably, the help of Allah is near. I think that was a comment. I mean, if there's no question associated with this, I'll move on to the next, but thank you for the comment. Okay, we have a question by Melanie. Thank you so much for the talk. In appreciation of the practical dimension of your talk, I feel comfortable sharing that since becoming a physically disabled woman, I've been more frequently touched, kissed by strangers and acquaintances in an unwanted, uninvited fashion. What guidelines are there in hospitality that counteract this potential misattribution of wanting to be touched to ill or disabled people? Perhaps there is something in the critique of controlling ill and disabled people. Yeah, what do you think, Hina?
Yes, thank you. That's a really, really important point. And certainly something I need to devote more thought to. I think, yes, there always is that danger of kind of romanticizing these forms of embodied connection and you know, turning them into things that can be applied irrespective of context, which is obviously not what we want to do. And I think there is something, as you very beautifully point out, in this idea of hospitality is moving away from this idea of control, and therefore, you know, considering issues of consent and consent and making sure that it is mutual and reciprocal and welcomed, right? Because if an act of hospitality is not welcomed, then is it really hospitality, right? So I think that's an important point. And yeah, I don't have anything concrete to offer, but thank you for that. That's really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Hina. There is one comment, more of a common question kind. Albert, beautiful presentation. According to the gradation of being theory, Tashkik al-Wujud, the intensity of the manifestations of God's names and attributes varies from one state of being to another, from one time to another, etc. I believe we can deploy this theory to argue that had it not been for the variety of the change that sickness and other tribulations introduce into our lives, we would be never able to discern the existential degrees of God's presence in our lives.
Okay, I agree. Is that a comment or a question? Well, I think that's a comment, right?
You can answer it with a comment, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I like that idea.
Okay. We have all words of appreciations for your beautiful presentations. I'm waiting to see if there are any more questions. Okay, one more here, I guess. So that was an appreciation. Any other questions? All right, wonderful.